Joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman from California, Barbara Lee, and for years now, a leader in the global battle against HIV/AIDS. I sat down with her recently on Capitol Hill. Congresswoman Lee, thank you, first of all, for talking to us. I want to start with last year's International AIDS Conference. You were on a panel with former President Bill Clinton, who talked about your work with him in addressing this issue while he was in office. And I'm kind of paraphrasing, so to speak, but he said, you were out there, you were one of the first people to understand what was at stake. And clearly you understand what's at stake now. When you look at sub-Saharan Africa, we've got, I believe it's 25 million in 2012 with HIV, 2.9 million children. Those numbers are staggering. Those numbers must keep you up at night. It's a tough, tough fight. Can it be brought under control?
It absolutely can be brought under control, and it is a tough, tough fight. But I just have to say, I think we can see an AIDS-free generation if we continue to invest in our global fund and in the President's initiative, the emergency initiative to address HIV and AIDS, PEPFAR. What I worry about now is that because of fiscal austerity, we could go backwards. We need to make sure that we move forward so that everyone who needs treatment receives treatment. Right now, there are about 15 million who need treatment. And so we need to continue to invest in our global AIDS initiatives.
Are there specific things on the ground that could be done now if there was more money funneled in that direction?
Sure, and I've visited many countries in Africa and throughout the world who are really dealing with this pandemic. Many things can be done on the ground. We can fund more country-directed, community-based organizations that provide care, treatment, and community education. I've seen some wonderful programs that need to be replicated. We need to empower women more in terms of micro-enterprise, because the empowerment of women is really key to addressing HIV and AIDS. We need to also invest more in infrastructure, and we're beginning to see some of this. If we have the medicines but no way to transport the medicines, for instance, to the villages, then how will people receive their medications? So we have to look at transit systems and how to create more community clinics and access to the antiretroviral drugs as we enhance our treatment mechanisms.
Having been to the area, you know, we always talk about numbers, but there are names behind the numbers. There are faces behind the figures. There are probably stories that have touched you when you come back to the United States. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I met the first person who benefited from PEPFAR. I met him in Uganda last year, and initially he had received a death sentence because there was no way he was going to live with the virus. I met him, and it was quite an emotional moment because he told me that he was married now, had children, and was finishing his college education and working in the villages in Uganda on HIV/AIDS prevention programs. You multiply this by millions of people. I also have visited many countries where I have seen and attended funerals of teachers, of children. The teachers died of AIDS, the children have the virus. I've seen villages almost totally decimated. I've seen children, 10-year-old children, 12-year-old children raising their 2- and 3-year-old siblings because their parents have died. This is beginning to turn around. Now, there have been reports that the coffin-making business is not a booming business anymore in Africa because fewer people are dying from the virus because of what we have generously provided. So there are good stories, and there are many stories that have touched my heart. I mean, to be able to travel throughout Africa now and not see as many coffins being made, not see as many funerals, that's a good story. But we have a long way to go, and that's why this is a real defining moment, and we need to continue to invest in PEPFAR and in the Global Fund so that we can achieve the success that we know we can achieve.
You know, it's interesting, when people look at Washington, D.C., they see a city that's broken when it comes to the legislative process. But you've been here for a long time. You've worked with President Clinton, who had praise for you. You've called former President George W. Bush bold and brave for what he did on the AIDS front. You've worked with President Obama. It's been a bipartisan issue here in this area in Washington, D.C. Can world leaders take a page from Washington, D.C. and do more, do you think?
Let me tell you, it's been very challenging, but I think because of what we've been able to do in a bipartisan way, world leaders can look at what we are doing, continuing to do here in Congress in a bipartisan way to achieve an AIDS-free generation. For example, the initial bill that was signed into law, the Global AIDS and Tuberculosis Relief Act, that's what President Bill Clinton signed into law. Well, that was a joint effort by myself and then chair of the Banking Committee, Congressman Chairman Jim Leach, who was a Republican.
You know, having been to South Africa, I want to throw a question at you about stigma, because that's obviously a huge issue here in the United States, around the world, but especially in sub-Saharan Africa. In one black township, they did a survey and asked about AIDS, and 11% believe that AIDS is caused by spirits and supernatural forces. 21% were unsure if it was caused by spirits and supernatural forces. Then the stigma index done in Uganda. A large percentage of the people talked about being forced to undergo sterilization. They lost their jobs, excluded from family activities, physically assaulted. Stigma is still a big issue on that continent. Is AIDS education just as important for sub-Saharan Africa? What can be done about that?
Well, it's still a big issue, stigma here in our own country. And let me tell you, in sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, AIDS education is very important, both in sub-Saharan Africa and here in our own country. There was a story, and it was a true story, about a woman early on who was killed in a village in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal area, when she decided to come forward and talk about this and made an announcement that she was HIV positive, and she was killed. And there are many, many stories like this throughout the continent. And so we have to really be very vigilant in how we as the United States, as our own country, directs money into public education and awareness campaigns in Africa and here in our own country. Here we have to work with the clergy, the African American clergy, to be able to bring, you know, some of the key messages about education to the African American community in America. And so there's an issue of stigma here as well as in South Africa that has to be overcome.
We're just about out of time, but what is the biggest obstacle in your mind to getting HIV/AIDS under control?
Oh, I think the biggest obstacle, really, and some may disagree, but it's funding. I think if we had, first of all, the global fund at $15 billion, with our contribution, the United States contribution at $5 billion, and if we have a target of 12 million on treatment, I think we can overcome, and we will. And so the biggest obstacle right now is, during this fiscal austerity climate, convincing members of Congress and the public that their tax dollars are well spent by helping to prevent a disease that we know we can overcome.
Well, I suspect you're going to be working very hard on doing that convincing.
Yes.
Thanks so much for
Thank
spending
you.
time with us.
Okay.
Certainly appreciate it.
Happy to be with you.